The interesting thing is that although laissez-faire seemed to be bringing everything that its proponents had promised, the standard of living of the ordinary people in Britain rose greatly. There was an industrial revolution. Britain became the leading industrial nation of the world. And yet, at the same time, the support for laissez-faire started to ebb, and you had the beginning of the next tide, the movement toward socialism, which we called the Fabian tide. How do you explain that? Well, there are a number of things that help to explain it. In the first place, as things got better, the evils that remained were more striking and prominent. You know, there are always problems in a society. You're never going to have perfection. That's for utopias for the next world, not for this one. And so, having solved many of the problems which existed before, the remaining ones stand out. In the second place, one of the main forces helping to, the conquest of laissez-faire ideas was widespread corruption. In the 18th century, Britain was known as a land of smugglers. There was widespread evasion of the law. There was widespread corruption of public officials. But under laissez-faire, when government had nothing to give, when there were no privileges it could grant, Britain developed an incorruptible, largely incorruptible, a very honest and efficient civil service. And therefore, it became more feasible to think that government could do things, could do good. As you all know, the power to do good is also the power to do evil. In any event, in 1888, you had the establishment of the Fabian Society by the Webbs, by Shaw, by a small group of British intellectuals. That was 1888. Its ideas, the Fabian ideas, gradually spread among the intellectual classes. And within 20, 25, 30 years, they were the standard climate of opinion on the intellectual level. But effects on policy did not follow for many years. The move toward a welfare state really only began just before World War I, with the beginning of Social Security programs. And it didn't come to a full flood until after World War II, 1945, about 60 years after the initial change in the direction of the tide of opinion. In the United States, much the same thing was true. In the 1988, Edward Bellamy published his utopian socialist fantasy, Looking Backward. It sold 1 million copies, which is a tremendous sale in a country whose population was a great deal smaller than the population of the United States is now, if I remember rightly, under 100 million. And the ideas of socialism, the Fabian ideas, the Marxian ideas, all started to have their impact on the intellectual classes within the United States. The first decades of the 20th century was the era, just before the World War I, was the era of muckrakers, of Ida Tarbell, of Sinclair Lewis. But action was very limited. The one action in the 1890s was trust busting, but that had a different source. By the 1920s, after World War I, socialism was a dominant view among the intellectual class in general. Norman Thomas was a presidential candidate of the Socialist Party in 1928, and his platform was widely accepted. However, policy did not change. Actual practice remained much the same until the Great Depression. The Great Depression, which started in 1929 and really lasted throughout the 30s, had two effects. On the one hand, it converted the general public at large to the view of the intellectuals. Whereas the public at large had regarded government as a necessary evil in the relatively laissez-faire 19th and early 20th century, it took the Depression, it regarded the impression as proving that there was something wrong with free markets, and converted the public at large to the view that government, far from being a necessary evil, was the answer to all real problems. The result was the New Deal and the great growth of government, supported by public opinion. Within a few decades, every single economic plank of the socialist 1928 platform had been enacted. So if you take the socialist platform of 1928 and read it today, it sounds like a very moderate platform that could be supported by either the Republicans or the Democrats. But it took a long time again. Opinion was changing in the United States in the 1890s, 80s. It was not until the 1930s or 40s, 50 years or so, before it really started to take effect. And then, of course, the war produced another stimulus. But this, in turn, just as the triumph of laissez-faire had led to the Fabian tide, the triumph of socialist ideas, and particularly their spread in the most extreme form to Germany and to Russia first and Germany later, led to what we've called the Hayek tide. Beginning with Hayek's Road to Serfdom, there started a gradual intellectual movement which gained adherents through time and has now led to the point where the overwhelming sentiment in the nation at large is in favor of free markets. And yet, as we see, the government continues to grow. But it's not an unmixed situation. The inflation, just as it took the Great Depression to change public opinion as opposed to intellectual opinion, the inflation of the 70s served very much the same function in the United States and around the world. And that was very much reinforced later by the fall of the Berlin Wall. The inflation of the 70s produced great doubts about the effectiveness of government in pursuing its objectives. The objectives of government, as you all know, are always very good. The argument is with the means and with the consequences of those means, particularly the unintended consequences of those means. You have to pardon me, but my throat gets very dry as I talk. And the result, the inflation of the 70s was a major factor that led the public at large to get disaffected and led to the election of Thatcher in Britain and Reagan in the United States. And they started a process of gradual dismantling of the all-powerful welfare state. You had in the United States a reduction in tax rates. In Britain, the same thing. You had a lifting of price and wage controls in Britain. You had a lifting of foreign exchange controls. You had privatization, and privatization continues to spread. You had some reduction in regulations. In all cases in the 1980s, both in Britain and the United States, you can say that you were really having an impact of the tide of opinion on actual practice. But unfortunately, that was not very strong, and in my opinion, what has happened since the fall of the Berlin Wall has had a rather surprising effect. The fall of the Berlin Wall cemented the change in the climate of opinion. It really made it universal. But it also led to undue complacency on the part of the West. After all, they were doing it all wrong, and look at what happened to them. We're doing it all right, and look at what's happening to us. We don't really have to change. We can just keep on going as it is. As a result, the pace of movement toward greater liberalization, in the sense in which you and I would use the term liberalization, slowed down. While government did not grow as fast as it had before, it continued to grow in most of the countries, or at most to stabilize. In the United States, it stabilized. Government spending today as a fraction of income is less than it was in 1983, when the Reagan Revolution started to have its impact. In Britain, it's about the same. But in many of the countries of Western Europe, spending today as a fraction of income is higher than it was then. If you look at the picture worldwide, you have to add another dimension which I've left out of it altogether. As our hypothesis stressed, these tides of opinion tend to be worldwide. They are not in a single nation. Just as the Adam Smith tide, the tide of belief in laissez-faire, spread throughout the world, in its case, very much promoted by the importance of the British Empire. Similarly, the Fabian tide, the Marxian tide, the tide toward collectivism, toward socialism, was worldwide, leading to, in its extreme, to what happened in Russia and later in Germany. So also, the current tide is worldwide. And here again, it's interesting to note that the most dramatic impact of it has been in the communist countries. In China, ever since Deng freed up agriculture in the 1970s, you have had a very strong movement toward greater and greater free markets, greater and greater private enterprise. The political structure is totalitarian. It has not changed. It is unacceptable. But there is no doubt that a conflict such as emerged in Tiananmen Square will emerge again, because what is happening on the economic front is fundamentally incompatible with the political structure. If you take the former Soviet Union, in countries like the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, wherever you, Latvia, Lithuania, wherever you look in that part of the world, the tide of practice, and not only of opinion, has changed. They are far closer to free markets than they were. They still have a way to go, of course. On the other hand, Russia itself is in chaos. But Russia will not remain in chaos. I have no doubt that we will see many changes in the future which will move in our direction. So if we look at the world as a whole, we can say that the contrast between the state of opinion on the one hand and practice on the other is part of a long-term cyclical process. And that is very important for our view, because note that in each of these cases, as the tide of opinion started and did have its effect on actual practice, opinion itself started to ebb. It was just, remember, when laissez-faire was at its height in Britain, that you started to have a change in the tide of opinion toward socialism and collectivism. It was just as the effect of socialist opinion on practice was having its major impact when welfare states were worldwide, that you started to have a change in opinion away from socialism. And so those of us who believe in freedom and free markets have to watch and try to avoid getting caught in the same situation. As and when our ideas become more and more embedded in practice, there will be a tendency for opinion to shift the other way. So I conclude by saying that there is great reason for hope for those of us who believe in freedom and individualism. The tide of opinion has been reaching near its height. It is having an impact on practice, but so far only a small impact. But the lag is not so different as in these other cases. In 1944, I dated the beginning of the Hayek tide. It's now 50-some years later, and just about the same lag as you saw in the other cases. Thank you.